Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you got some coffee to get you going through the afternoon. So welcome to this session. I'm Clemencia Cosentino. I am here from FAO. I'm the director of the Office of Evaluation, and I am delighted to be moderating an excellent panel that showcases the work that is happening at FAO. And before we begin, I just want to give you some logistics details, which is we have 4 presenters, very little time. So each of them has 10 minutes to present. I will introduce the presenter, then they will speak for 10 minutes. I will take 2 questions and we move on to the next presenter because we don't want to shortchange the people at the end, you know, the later presenters. But there will be time at the end to ask more questions. So don't think that because we didn't take your question after the presenter, you don't get to ask it. There will be time at the end for that. But then at that point, you will benefit from all of the presentations. I think you will be surprised to hear that all of these presentations are related to the use of geospatial and remote sensing data. You probably expected something different, but all of them have things in common, and I would like to flag some for you to be sort of start thinking about. They're all trying to identify a counterfactual when we're looking to do impact evaluations retrospectively, which of course it's always ideal to try to plan prospectively about what we're going to do, but reality is we oftentimes make a decision to do an evaluation later on, and we were not there at the beginning to either design or to collect baseline data. And so what are some opportunities that are created by geospatial and remote sensing data? These presentations also showcase some innovative ways of conducting the analysis to produce true impacts. And I am happy to say that I'm sure it's not controversial in this group to say that we're defining impacts as cause and effect relationships. So that's what we're trying to get at. How do we specify the analysis and run our models to try to estimate true impacts of causal relationships? So I invite you to look at, to consider as these presenters describe their studies, try to pick out the sort of the methodological insights that emerge, some of the challenges that they encounter, some of the opportunities that they were able to leverage to combine, for example, these data with existing administrative data, with existing survey data, because the reality is, as promising as these data sources are, as well as other data sources, by themselves are insufficient. Usually this is an addition to our toolkit, and it has to be complemented by other information that we need to merge in, and that creates, again, opportunities and challenges. So be on the lookout for that and see how that pairing is being done with the different presenters. So our first presenter is actually online, is Dan Runfola, who is an associate professor of applied science and data science at William & Mary. His core expertise is in the applied use of machine learning to analyze satellite data to better understand environmental impacts around the world. He's presenting on the results of an evaluation done for the Office of Evaluation, along with Luisa Belli, who is sitting here from our office. And he will be presenting on a quasi-experimental evaluation of the impact of the intervention activities on degraded land restoration. So let me pass it on to Dan to begin his presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. Just very briefly, am I safe to share my screen at this point?
Yes, go ahead.
Get to see my playlist here for a moment as I get my screen up. All right, can you all see this?
We see it.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so thanks so much for the introduction. So I'm Dan Runfola. Just to give you a little bit of my background in this space. I've previously worked with the IPCC as a contributing author. I've done a number of interventions over the last, evaluations of interventions over the last 10 years for the GEF, the FAO, and a number of other organizations. This particular project was a really interesting one. And one that we were focused around trying to assess some early stage impacts of AAD, which was Actions Against Desertification. And so trying to see how we could marry satellite image to start to look at how effective that project was in its earlier stages. A lot of fun, and I think a lot of lessons learned as well. So this analysis was largely predicated upon a combination of Landsat and Sentinel data. I presume many of you in the room have probably seen satellite images that look like this before, but just in case not, this is an example of the type of data we were using to actually monitor forest cover, especially fluctuations across all of the projects we were assessing. As you can see, you can get pretty granular information about the number of trees, the types of trees, canopy structure, texture, all sorts of information. And we really want to start to exploit this. This is not new. We've been doing this for 20, 30 years, but where this is exciting is how we can tie this into these questions around causal inference using geospatial data. Did our interventions actually cause a change in the patterns we're observing? So here, the specific case study we were working on, again, was Action Against Desertification. So within this, there were numerous countries that we were looking at. And across different countries, there were different natures of interventions. So some of these were very suitable intervention types for assessing with satellite data, things like plowing and planting new vegetation. Some, though, were less so. So things like diversification of local economic bases. There was a lot of efforts around beekeeping. And so one interesting thing here was that we kind of limited the scope of what we were able to analyze to really just those outcomes that one could reasonably expect you can see with relatively coarse resolution satellite imagery. So there are some inherent limits on kind of what we can accomplish here. The scope in this particular case, so there were about 600 AAD intervention locations that had geospatial boundary information. This was nearly unheard of in this space. I've been doing geospatial impact evaluations for nearly a decade now, which is shocking. And I don't think I've ever had an N of over 600. So incredible props to the implementation team led by Mokhtar to actually collect this amount of data. These implementations were commencing in early 2018. We were doing the analysis in late 2019, early 2020. So we were looking at relatively early stage impacts over that 2-year period. We were specifically interested in measuring shifts in gross primary productivity caused by the project. So the early stage interventions effects. So this is where things, I think, get very interesting in that we are trying to effectively construct a quasi-experimental trial using ancillary geospatial information retrospectively. And one of the really nice things that we can do here is that we don't just have access to satellite data, but we have access to a huge amount of information that can be used as controls. If we want to match areas where we did implement an intervention to areas where we did not implement an intervention, we obviously want those to be as similar as possible to make sure that our contrasts are valid. There's all sorts of data out there. This is a table illustrating what we used for this particular study. I think some of you may have attended earlier in the session or earlier in the conference a presentation on GeoQuery, where we actually got a lot of this data. So there's tools out there that make it very easy to access information like this, which is absolutely wonderful. Our overall goal here was to use all of this information to select the most appropriate kind of control cases, areas where there was no intervention. To do this, we generated 10,000 synthetic locations to assess. We then matched intervention locations to the most similar location of those 10,000 potential control cases. There were a number of different limitations around this. Specifically, we looked at the geospatial location of the interventions. So we didn't want to match too close to the intervention because there could naturally be spillover effects. However, we also didn't want to match too far away because there are similar political constraints and other unmeasured confounds that if we match relatively close, we may be able to mitigate those biases. So we tried to kind of make almost like a donut where you have a hole where you don't want to create your controls, and then you kind of have a ring around that area where you would like to identify kind of the geospatial region of optimal controls. You can see a couple of examples of what these actually looked like from satellite imagery on this slide. So on the top is the actual intervention community, and on the bottom are similar communities that we identified using this strategy. So relatively geospatially close, similar along all of the measured dimensions that we had. These are natural, these are quasi-experimental at the end of the day, right? These were not controls selected through a randomized process or a randomized control trial process, but they at least visually look quite similar, and along all of our measurable dimensions, they were quite similar as well. We then put these, so that was all done through a propensity score matching approach. We then put our matched pairs into a number of different modeling, linear models and other models. And these are kind of what some of the initial results looked like. Again, these were over these kind of preliminary results of the interventions over 2-year periods. And some of the interesting things that started to emerge was some early evidence of positive or impact, at least in Senegal, Gambia, and Ethiopia. We did not see immediate stage impacts across all countries that we looked at. There were certainly differential impacts. Some of that, we believe, was guided by the nature of the intervention. So as I mentioned, some of these interventions were more focused on local economic bases, so beekeeping and other types of strategies. Those, of course, are not as readily evident in satellite imagery, and thus it was much more difficult, and we had smaller ends in some of those locations for actual interventions that would be manifest in satellite imagery. But we did begin to detect some trends using this strategy. One of the really neat things about geospatial information is that you can also try to get an idea of the geographic reach of interventions. So when you implement an intervention within a community, it obviously doesn't only impact that community. It will also impact neighboring areas. And so we did an analysis looking at how far is that reach? How far out do we actually see that extend beyond the local community? In this particular case, after that 2-year period, we began to see effects that were extending about statistically significant effects out to about 1 kilometer of distance. So we could start to measure just not just the localized footprint of our effects, but actually beyond that as well. One of the final things that we began to explore was the kind of global carbon benefits that accrued due to these projects. This was done through basically proxying for the amount of carbon sequestered based on increased GPP, and we proxied that using NDVI, a satellite metric. The takeaway I would really like you to take from this slide is there is tremendous uncertainty in carbon valuation right now. There's 2 big sources of uncertainty here. First is the actual measurements of carbon, but second, probably more predominant, is the tremendous variation in different agencies' valuation of a ton of carbon being sequestered. So we end up with ranges per project between basically $0 all the way up to around $10 million US dollars of value from these projects. So there's a couple of things I want to prompt for you guys to think about as we go forward in the other presentations here. Kind of 3 things that we really highlighted in this project that we're concerned about going forward, and some of the challenges we want to overcome for geospatial impact evaluations. The first of these is errors in underlying data sets. So it's not just the data that we bring to the table, the actual measurements of where the intervention occurred, but for example, satellite-based metrics of precipitation. They are very accurate, but they still have imprecision and error. Satellite-based metrics of population density have quite a lot of error at higher resolutions. And how to cope with those errors is a big void in the literature right now. There's not a lot of clarity on how to handle those propagations of errors into quasi-experimental models explicitly. The second big limit is imprecision in measurement. So there's this particular project, we had really, really good measurements, but we didn't have everything measured. We didn't have every intervention that occurred. Some of the polygons might have been drawn around the community of intervention as opposed to, say, the crops of intervention. And so these types of spatial imprecisions, again, there's some guidance in the literature, but not a lot of how to cope with those challenges. And then just broadly, spatial matching of controls is really an underdeveloped literature. How big should we make our donut ring, for example, is a hard question, and it drives a lot of our conclusions, and there's just not a lot of clarity of kind of what the right answers to some of these questions are. It was really exciting working with the FAO practitioners kind of that had been on the ground to try to establish what these thresholds should be based on local knowledge. But that's a very qualitatively driven approach and something that's not easily extensible to other contexts without that local knowledge. So there's a lot to be worked on there. That's all I've got for you guys. Thank you very much. And here's my email if you want any follow-ups as well.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. And on top of that, that was exactly 10 minutes. So that sets a standard for everyone else. So first, let me ask if anyone has any questions, any follow-ups, clarifications. Sure, go ahead.
So on that last point, it strikes me one of the important things is what was the choice set from which that intervention was chosen? Obviously, if you only have two possibilities, then you're much more worried about the selection bias associated with the treatment. Whereas if this place was chosen from a set of 10 or 15, you're probably less worried. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
So you mean during project implementation, the selection procedures?
Yes, exactly. Like that's data that's probably useful and yet it wasn't discussed.
Yeah, so we had some of that information, but it was highly variable based on country, and it was largely predicated on kind of qualitative decision making. There was not a randomization at any stage in that particular selection process, so we kind of discounted it. That said, you're absolutely correct, right? Like even if it's not fully randomized, we could still use that information to try to better mediate some of these concerns. But no, we didn't go down those roads.
Thank you, Dan. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Vivek from Atlas AI. Could you say a little bit more about the matching procedure? Was that some kind of similarity search on the attributes you tabulated in your presentation?
Sure. So what we actually...
Before you answer, can I add to that? Can you talk a little bit about what you talked about the variables that you could measure, that you had access to for matching, and if you could talk about whether there were other critical variables that you would have included but didn't have.
Well, since my good colleague from Atlas asked this question, I will say something that is relevant to them, which is we don't have a lot of localized socioeconomic data, right? Data, for example, on income or gender distribution or other factors that we now believe, based on the work of my good colleague, that we can start to estimate with satellite imagery. So there's a lot of kind of, especially on the socioeconomic side, lack of data for matching. So what you're looking at here is kind of the full list of what we used. And you'll see on the socioeconomic side, we effectively have nighttime lights as a proxy for income and population. And that's really everything else is biophysical. And so there's certainly strong weaknesses on the socioeconomic side for matching. And I think that there's a lot of excitement and a lot of work being done to try to overcome some of those challenges. As to the specific question on propensity score matching, so this is one of my backup slides that I fortunately had that talks a little bit about how we did this. So propensity score matching, effectively, if you've not implemented it before, what you do is you calculate for every single one of your treatment and control cases the probability that it would have received an intervention. And so, for example, even for every single control location, you can model, based on where you did have interventions, the likelihood that it should have or could have received an intervention. Those probabilities are then used to match. And so the goal being, if you have a treated case that was 100% likely to be treated, or where an intervention was, you want a control case that was also 100% likely based on the demographic and other characteristics that we measured. Conversely, if you had one that was only 50% likely, you would want to match it with something that's 50% likely. This is effectively matching along the dimensions that were not random at the initial intervention selection. This is based on Rubin causality model and all sorts of other stuff that I'm sure everyone in the room has probably heard about. So that was our approach in this particular case. The actual matching algorithm was just a greedy nearest algorithm after we calculated those propensity scores. And what you're seeing here is the actual distribution of similarities after matching occurred and before the matching occurred.
Thank you, Dan, for that additional information. So again, a round of applause. Thank you very much. It's actually very fitting that your presentation ends with, and we need to do more research. We need to do more. So we're going to move on to the next speaker, who's Paula, who's sitting right next to me. And she She is one of our own. She works at FAO's Agri-Food Economics Division, and she has more than 20 years of experience conducting microeconomic analysis, studying gender equality and poverty reduction policies, and of course, doing impact evaluations. So, Ana Paula, it's yours.
Thank you, Clemencia, and thank you, everyone. Again, welcome to Rome. We're very happy to have this discussion going on at FAO. So in the same line, I'm going to be talking about the same project that Dan was referring to. Thank you. But we're just going to focus here on the actions, the activities that were developed in northern Nigeria. So this is work that is joint work with Carly Petraco, Elsa Valli, Nicola Sitko, and Laura Dayetti. These are people from different parts of FAO, including from the forestry division. So very in line with what this gathering is trying to foster, right? Bringing different expertise. Okay. So I'm going to give you a bit more content about AAD and basically the motivation of our study, because when we were approached by the implementers of this project was to precisely look at the socioeconomic impacts that, Dan was referring to were lacking in previous studies of AAD. So we were mostly concerned about whether climate actions could meet both biophysical and socioeconomic objectives. And this is because, at least in FAO, we're concerned about this issue that climate actions require, obviously, changes in people's behavior, in the ways that natural resources are managed and how people benefit from those natural resources. And of course, those desired effects at the biophysical level may also might need several years to develop, and also for local populations to benefit. So we specifically look at the case of Nigeria. Is the Action Against Desertification is a project that was implemented in the Great Green Wall area of the Sahel. And well, I will talk more about the specificities of the project. But so what I think it's important to highlight here is that there's a lot at stake in terms of land restoration. The Sahel region in Africa is highly vulnerable to land degradation, and desertification is one kind of land degradation that is really affecting several countries across the Sahel. So there's this idea of building a Great Green Wall, which is establishing a transitional zone in this area. And as you can see, it's a humongous part of the world that is crossing arid and semi-arid zones in the north and south sides of the Sahara. It covers 8 countries. It covers around 780 million hectares. And so estimates, some estimations have been assessed saying that around 10 million hectares are needed each year in order to halt and reverse land degradation. So as you can see, it's a huge challenge that we have. But at the same time, we're concerned about the short-term impacts of land restoration, right? Because these are areas with high extreme poverty and food insecurity. And when these kinds of projects are implemented, there might be the need of a temporary access restriction to the local populations to these areas and in particular, when no alternative livelihoods are promoted. So that's why we're focusing on the socioeconomic analysis of these actions. And as we've seen in the discussions of this gathering is saying, well, there's a lot of quantitative evidence from impact evaluations of the field of climate actions, environmental actions, also agricultural interventions still lack a lot in terms of specifically looking at socioeconomic analysis. We've been discussing why it's so hard to implement impact evaluations in this context. There's a lot of issues in relation to the timing of these projects, the heterogeneity of interventions, the longer periods needed for impacts to materialize, and so forth. And so our contribution with this piece is looking at particularly the impacts of land restoration on food security and livelihoods diversification. And also considering that there have been several studies looking at the biophysical level impacts, no? And so we're also, just as a side note, as part of the GeoField, we're also working with a data to look more closely to at the biophysical effects of this project and trying to associate that with socioeconomic indicators. So just quickly, Action Against Desertification. As Dan presented, it was implemented in 6 countries in the Sahel. This is an approach that is it's going to be scaled up as well through a new project from next year. So we're very excited about that. And basically combine 2 kinds of interventions. The main one in terms of biophysical levels was this large-scale mechanized restoration in common lands. It's a bit similar to the Demi-Lune case study that was presenting this morning, and where delfino ploughs are carving these half moons in the restoration areas. But it also has a very strong approach with the communities, no? And so, for example, it involves communities in the selection of tree species for restoration, with the idea that this will create incentives for the local population to protect this investment, right? It also fosters seed production as an additional income source, and of course, provided tons of training in terms of commercialization of high-value non-timber forest products, as well as livestock byproducts. So we ran with the typical case of not having, coming into the evaluation late. So we came after the end, so at the end of this evaluation, where we were asked to build a study. So there was no baseline data for the purpose of impact evaluation. In fact, there was a survey conducted, but not for the purpose of impact evaluation. And so to address this, we created a counterfactual based on spatial and train data on the project areas before the program. So basically, we partnered with colleagues here at FAO that use supported vector machine that applied to both biophysical and socioeconomic data for similarity analysis on treated plots before the program to identify similar neighboring plots. So once those plots were identified at baseline data, basically, we were able to also select the communities, the control communities, as well as the control households, because we replicated the targeting process as well, to be able to then deploy our household survey. So again, we relied on several sources of data. The main outcomes were analyzed through household and community surveys, implemented around 3 to 4 years after the start of the activities. But we also used a lot different sources of spatial data. So we used around 14 indicators of both biophysical and socioeconomic aspects to build the counterfactuals. So that was what the supervector machine used. And we also, in our econometrics approach, we use different sources of spatial data, including the Atlas AI welfare measure, as well as the SPAY-based risk factor on extreme weather events, as well as NDVI. In terms of methods, whereas the typical quasi-experimental approach, where we used a doubly robust inverse probability weighted regression estimator. So basically, to simplify, was a matching approach where we used both variables from the survey as well as other variables to balance our control and treatment samples. And here, as you can see, we used mostly socioeconomic variables that were likely not to be affected by the intervention, as well as, some other sources of information like improved lighting source, for example, to control for potential socioeconomic baseline differences. And so, after that, we use this estimated inverse probability weights to model our impact evaluation. So I'm gonna go through the results. It's more interesting. So what we found is that no evidence of negative implications. There were no negative implications in terms of food security at household level as a result of this intervention. In fact, AAD, the program, led to an increase in food security and improvements in subjective measures of food access, with participants worrying less about not having enough to eat, skipping less meals, and not running out of food as often. In terms of the mechanisms, we also checked, we observed changes in households' livelihood strategies toward more climate resilience activities, for example, decreasing resilience on crop sales, which potentially was a mechanism for increasing food consumption, and increased sales on livestock byproducts and high-value non-timber forest products as well. In terms of means of verification, the treated households were more likely to allocate more labor to work for communal lands and to have received more agricultural information, which was part of the intervention, collect more non-timber forest products, as well as fodder, because that was one of the mechanisms that AAD pay attention to. So to provide a feed for their cattle. And so we also observed no increase in grazing patterns in communal lands. So this demonstrates that the communities allowed for the natural environment to regenerate. So of course, we encounter several limitations. Again, there are issues around external validity, the fact that livelihoods and the potential diversification outcomes in other restoration areas are going to be very different. That also this particular project has a very strong focus on participatory approaches, and other land restoration programs might not have that, as well as that the targeting of restoration actions, of course, including in our survey, the way we identify the counterfactual was based mostly on the suitability for restoration and not on household characteristics. And finally, in terms of temporal limitations, we of course still need to assess the long-term effects of these interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You did in under 10 minutes, so we're raising the bar. Any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your very informative presentation. My question is just on the definition of adult. Adult. Yes, for your socioeconomic variables. On that graph, you present, the number of adults. And I'm seeing there how you have defined adult. And I'm going there because for the sake of comparing the findings or this study to other studies, I'm just checking how you defined adults. Thank you.
I mean, it's based on age, but I have to go and see exactly. There's a working paper that I can share to you, and I don't remember right now the age range, but can get back to you.
Yeah, so Arthur Mabiso from IFAD. Just a question, which is actually something we also are struggling with, is in terms of your the data sources, right, for the remote sensing data. Because we've tested in some of our papers, and we find that depending on the source, the data source you use, the effects change quite a bit. So just wondering how you're dealing with this. How is there a standard approach in terms of what we should be using, how we should be using this data? Thanks.
So you're referring to the super vector machine, no? The data that was used for that. So
Yes.
This is precisely where we're leveraging on GeoField expertise, because we've provided also our coordinates as well as the survey data. So we're in the process of validating that using a different approach. Because as I mentioned, we're going to scale up this impact evaluations, hopefully now with baseline data information from next year. This is a Green Climate Fund funded project in 8 countries. And so we're hoping to refine this approach for the future. So happy to get back to you on that.
Thank you. So once again, we end on the need to replicate and do more. So, no. So thank you very much. So we're going to move to the third speaker, Solene Masson. She's joining online. She's also an economist and geospatial impact evaluation specialist at FAO. She is passionate about innovative technologies, and her research interests are mainly related to data management and data visualizations. She works on quantitative analysis in a large range of topics, dealing with environmental impacts, agriculture, food security, climate change, and the rural population. The sort of thing you would expect at FAO. So no surprises there. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna just share my screen. So let me know once you see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, and Lord, I'll put it in presenter mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's okay. So today I'm going to introduce a research paper quite different from what has been presented so far, because it's not an impact evaluation dealing with project, but it's much more an impact evaluation dealing with something you may know, the war in Ukraine. So the title of this presentation is going to be the impact of the war in Ukraine on yields in Comoros. And this paper was co-written with my colleagues Regine Weber, Shamsidine Ibrahim, and Christian Morales Opaso. So as I was mentioning, and you may all know the recent war in Ukraine in early 2022, involving both the Ukraine country, but also Russia, and why this is actually important for other countries and leads to some other consequences for mostly African continent. This is because Russia is one of the most important global producers for three main inorganic fertilizers, such as the nitrates, the potash, and the phosphorus. And actually, the main consequences occurred within the spring of 2022, with a large fertilizer prices peaked, and also fertilizer disruption on trade markets. And as the literature mentioned, any decrease in fertilizer utilization will lead to a notable decline in productivity throughout the African continent. And this decline in productivity could potentially pose serious implications for food security. And so actually, as I was mentioning, these events lead to some disruption effect on fertilizer, but also on the fertilizer price. And it was occurring just during the preparation of the growing season for most countries located within the Southern Hemisphere. And so far, there is a huge literature gap dealing with this impact due to a data gap, actually. And so this study seeks to deal with one of the country. So the country we're going to deal with is the Union of Comoros. So Comoros is a small island developing state, and being part of the SEEDS means that this country has some vulnerabilities, such as the geographic isolation, but also limited access to natural resources. And this country is actually also highly dependent on imports. And if you look at the first figure, you can observe the annual Comoros fertilizer imports since 2019. And you can observe a fall in quantity imports after 2020. And if we go on the second slide, these actually figures show the monthly, so the frequency of the Comoros fertilizer imports from 2021 to 2022. And you can observe that most of fertilizer imports in Comoros were occurring during the preparation of the growing season, meaning before November in general. But in case of 2022, for example, there is almost no imports for fertilizer in Comoros, such as it might lead to some negative impact on the productivity. So one other issue that the Comoros deals with is the fact that almost 1/2 of the population is living under the poverty line. So this indices is quite outdated, as you can see, because it's from 2013. And this is the last but not least issue that this country is facing. This is a huge lack of information and up-to-date data, which has prevented a lot of empirical assessments and as well as the evaluation, the impact evaluation of this conflict. So as I was mentioning, this study seeks to assess the impact of the war in Ukraine on yield in Comoros through the fertilizer channel. So what are we using as data? So actually we were quite lucky because in 2021, during the fall of 2021, actually, a data collection was collected over the 3 islands. And you can see on the map, the red dot are actually the GIS plots. So we have information for almost 2,000 farmers. And thanks to this cross-sectional data, we have a lot of socioeconomic information, but also it allows us to identify our treated and control groups. So on this map, you can see the blue ones that are the treated group, and this treated group encompass all the farmers using fertilizers, so just before the conflict, so few months before the conflict. And in the black dots are actually the farmers not using fertilizers. So we actually complement this ground data using geospatial data. And the first benefit of using geospatial data in this case, it's that it allows us to go from a cross-sectional to a panel data. So we actually derive the normally difference vegetation index as a proxy for yields over the growing season for 4 years. So 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And we also use some complementary GIS control variables such as rainfall and night light data. So the methodology we use is actually a simple difference in difference, where, as I mentioned before, the dependent variable is going to be the NDVI, so proxy for yields. And the coefficient of interest will be the treatment, which is the interaction term between the treated and the post-time period, meaning the treated is going to take, this is going to be dummy variable taking the value 1 when the farmers is using chemical fertilizer, and the post-time period is going to be the growing season, so basically November 2022 to February 2023. And this is also a dummy variable taking the value 1 when the year is 2023. We also include the control, so based on the complementary GIS variable, but we also take benefit of the cross-sectional data by implementing and adding some fixed effects, such as the gender fixed effects, and also literacy fixed effects. So just to reinforce, the identification strategy is based on the fact that the survey was conducted just a few months before the conflict occurred, such that we know for sure that few months before the war, farmers were treated because they were declaring using chemical fertilizer, while in the and we also identified the control group as well. And so we also benefit from the exogenous shock, so the consequences of those of this war, which leads to some disruption on the fertilizer market, but also some price peaks. So in this study, we are not able to disentangle between both disruption effects and price effects. So I'm just gonna show you the main results of this impact evaluation, which shows that actually this war leads to a decrease in productivity by 1.6% for farmers using chemical fertilizer. And I'm just going to show this common trend because this is quite striking, that this methodology is robust, and we can then say that we have a causal impact of this conflict on yields in Comoros. So, to conclude, this study fills the literature gap since there is almost no impact evaluation dealing with such a topic so far, especially for African countries due to the lack of data. But we have to say also that without GIS data and without the combination actually of both survey data but also GIS data, this it will have been impossible to perform such analysis. And the main results show that the war in Ukraine decreased the agricultural productivity for Comorian farmers by causing disruption and a significant increase in prices, and then a lack of access to chemical fertilizers. We also provide other investigation and other interesting results, but also robustness check in the paper. So this paper will be published soon. So for those interested, if you want to have a look at it, it will be great, I think so. And there is still some limitation for this paper because actually the quantity estimate for the treatment coefficients might be improved since we are using GIS data and the NDVI then. And actually, we are quite lucky also because there is another data collection which is planned in 2023. So it will be nice to have an extension of this paper and show and compare actually the impact evaluation dealing with geospatial data, but also the impact evaluation of the same topic, but using only ground data, and compare the results to see whether there is such differences. Sorry. And finally, we could also think about using another vegetation index to improve the accuracy of the yield proxy. Thank you so much.
So quickly, any pressing questions? We have one more speaker and then we'll open it up. No? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Just one question. Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious if you've looked at kind of the future of a project like this and how it would scale to other economies, given restrictions caused by conflict across the globe. It seems like this is going to be very applicable to other use cases outside of, even just SIDs. So curious to know your thoughts generally on how this could scale and have an even greater impact globally.
So you mean for other countries?
Yes.
That could be interesting to think about other countries, but as you see, this paper actually deals with precise field data, which were collected just before a few months and few weeks before the conflicts. So we could think about developing for other countries, but I'm afraid that there is such a lack of data for some other African countries such that it will be impossible to have a correct or a good identification strategy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Solene, for that answer. So we're going to move to our last speaker, Antonio Scognamillo. I'm sorry, I'm having an allergy attack. Antonio is an economist with the Economic and Policy Analysis of Climate Change program at FAO. He leads a wide range of macro and microanalysis on climate vulnerability and adaptation, agricultural economics, inequality, poverty, food security, and resilience. His expertise is in servant design and methodology, as well as experimental and quasi-experimental evaluations. And I think his work is a nice complement to the prior presentations in that he uses geospatial information, not necessarily remote sensing data or satellite imagery, to improve the measurement of an outcome variable. So I will let him explain and provide more details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clemencia. Thank you, audience. The title of the presentation is No Man is an Island. And as you see, the subtitle is Especially Explicit Approach to Measure Development Resilience. Someone may think that I am in the wrong room, given the topic of the other session. Actually, as Clemencia told, I think I am in the right place because impact evaluation is related also to measurement issue of the underlying outcome. And I am in the right place because this is also another way, another area in which FAO give its contribution, not only in terms of impact evaluation and so applying a cross-cutting methodology for impact evaluation, but also developing measurement and indicator to monitor and to assess the impact of the project that an intervention that we are supporting. And last reason for which I am not in the other room is because the colleague of Mathematica didn't invite me. And so, a bit a moment of self-promotion. The paper after I've been sent for this conference has been also accepted by World Development. If you want to download the paper, you can scan the QR code or go directly look for the title. The title of the paper is the very same title of this presentation. The study has been co-authored by two brilliant researchers, good friends, Chun Song, that is also the other session, and Ada Ineshuk from FAO, and Chun recently joined the CJR, but they used to work with us at FAO. So why resilience? As you know, resilience has become a popular and influential concept in the development and humanitarian policy. It's a sort of buzzword. Every project aims, almost every project, to build the resilience, to enhance resilience, to affect the resilience of farmers, of people, of community, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we have very little evidence of the impact of the project on resilience. And in fact, despite the importance of the concept, the resilience measure have been used largely to build a narrative around the project, the intervention, the investment, but not for targeting purposes, and less for targeting purposes, and even less for impact evaluation. Why? Because resilience is both difficult to define and difficult to measure. Difficult to define, first of all, because you have to select the domain. There are different domains in which resilience, the concept of resilience may be applied. Engineering, environmental. In this case, we are focusing on development resilience. And then different to measure because, as you know, resilience is a latent variable. So we are not observing directly the resilience of the people or of the individual or the community, but we are observing some proxy of the resilience. So why resilient measure properly resilience is important for two main reasons, especially for development interventions. The first reason is targeting, to target the intervention. So we want to target the people that are less resilient, who are the ones that are more in danger in case of shock and other stress. And the second is also, and this is why I think I'm in the right place, for impact evaluation. So for evaluating the impact of the project, the investment, and intervention. So in the concept of development resilience has been polarized in two main strengths. Let's say humanitarian and development agency have developed this capacity-based index. Okay. One of the most prominent examples is the index developed by FAO, the resilience capacity index, and in particular by the RIMA team, which is hosted in the ESA division. This concept, this approach to measure the resilience basically imply that resilience is the capacity to ensure that the stress or the shock does not have a longer lasting adverse development consequences. Okay, so the other approach to measure the resilience, the other strength to measure the resilience is to consider resilience as a normative condition, so-called normative condition approach that has been pioneered by Barrett and Costas from a conceptual point of view in 2014, and then has been operationalized by Cissé and Barrett in 2018, who have developed the conditional moment of well-being approach, building on the literature basically on poverty trap. The bad news is that in 2022, Journal of Development Economics published a paper where Upton, con Stella Villoslada and Barrett himself tried to evaluate how this measure, different measures of resilience perform. And the message of the paper at the end is that the existing measure of resilience are all at best imperfect and at worst deeply flawed. So there is a call in the economic development researcher community to improve the measure of resilience. And the intuition underlying this study is that an easy and expensive way is to do that by accounting for the system feedback. To say it more simply, no man is an island. The resilience of the individual depends on the surrounding individuals and on the place where the people live. And we will see better how we operationalize this intuition. Basically, we are not reinventing the wheel. This concept that the resilience of a person depends on the individual, depending on the resilience of the surrounding, was already, let's say, conceptualized in the original paper of Barrett and Costas, but was not operationalized when this conceptual paper has triggered the measurement. So the intuition is conditioning the household well-being to the spatial interaction and the spatial dependence within a given geographic scope will improve the prediction of the well-being dynamic. This concept of resilience is mirroring the multidimensional notion of systemic risk that has become a buzzword after the pandemic. And also the concept is going closer, let's say, or towards the concept of systemic resilience, as has been theorized by Ignace et al. in 2022. So no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of a continent, a part of the main. So the concept was already there in 1624. We just try to operationalize this concept, how develop a data-driven framework that is rather inexpensive, that is built on the theory of resilience and the literature on the human system interaction, that measure household resilience while reflect the broader context where the household live. Here we use the word household because it's the application that we have used, but it can be used with also different aggregation. Generalize the existing method of resilience to measure resilience that are well established and well known within the community, and can be extended eventually to other resilience measurement. Okay, we started for a convenience choice from the measurable resilience developed by Barrett because it was easier to adapt these, let's say, conceptualization of spatial resilience to that framework. But in theory, may be extended also to the resilience intended at the capacity index as measured by FAO with the RIMA index. So here is only, I give you a taste on what we mean with the spatial heterogeneity, spatial dependence. So why the resilience of people depend on the surrounding individuals and on the characteristic of the place where they live. Basically, the characteristic of the place where they live shape the spatial heterogeneity, the community endowment, the institution, the topology, and here the link with the GeoField community. And the spatial dependence instead is shaped by the resource sharing, the spillover, the social learning. Here are all positive effects, but the social norm may be also something that undermine the individual resilience. If, as an example, is manifest as a social stigma. So, how this environment, affect the individual resilience is uncertain. There are, as I was saying, there are positive and negative possible effect, and a priori we do not expect any particular direction for the effect. So it could have been either negative or positive. Here is the results, only for giving you an intuition of how the story ended, of the comparison between the spatial measure of the resilience and the measure of resilience as a normative condition produced by CC and Barrett in 2018. We used basically the very same data set and the very same model specification just for comparison purposes. So we don't want to introduce any bias due to the functional code and so on and so forth. And you will see that the spatial measure of resilience improve the performance of the resilience indicator, minimizing the total error rate. In particular, we minimize the error of inclusion. So the people that have been deemed as not resilient, but tends to be resilient. That means that in our context, but can be different in another context. This is a context of northern Kenya, where in the village there is a lot of ethnic homogeneity. Here, the resilience of my surrounding, okay, improve as or better, as a positive correlation with my individual resilience. And this is true also when we aggregate, because one can think it is normal. Once you model the interaction between people within a village, so you are adding another variable and you are improving the specification, let's say the fitting of the model. But even aggregating the information at the village level, so using the village as a unit of analysis, the spatial measure of resilience outperform the aspatial measure of resilience produced by CC and Barrett. So that's it for now. So thank you for your attention. And if you have a question, I will be happy to answer.
Any questions about this presentation? So we have 9 minutes left. So I think what I will do is maybe give the floor first to Antonio and ask some general questions of all the panelists so that we can start drawing some parallels across all these presentations. So the first one is about opportunities. And I think that it would be nice to talk about the sort of main applications that you envision the work that you have been doing to advance sort of the practice of impact evaluations, and in particular, this sort of analytical framework that you're proposing.
Thank you. No, this has been topic largely treated during this conference. Of course, we know that this Earth observation, remote sensing data may be used for building counterfactual for impact evaluation, can be used for improving sampling. Okay. But, and this is, I can say, an aspect that has been a bit neglected, at least on the main page of GeoField, to improve the measurement of, improving the measurement, we are going to improve also the other aspect, impact evaluation and sampling. So to me, that's our the main application. And also in this context, we have used coordinates of household to model the spatial dependence. Why? Because it was inexpensive and was already there. Okay. But if there are Earth observation, remote sensing data, we can use this information to model better the spatial dependence and the complex system of interaction of the human being with the surrounding environment to improve the measurement of resilience, but also other type of outcome that may manifest spatial clustering or better spatial dependence. Over.
So this actually circles back to the first presentation and one of the conclusions around precision and measurement. So I wonder, Dan, if you wanted to weigh in and share some of your thoughts on this topic of opportunities for improved measurement.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity here. One, the devices that are actually used to measure the geospatial location of these types of interventions have dropped in cost dramatically by multiple orders of magnitude over the last decade. Even when I was in grad school 20 years ago, you were talking thousands of dollars to buy an accurate GPS unit. Now we literally all have one in our pocket. And so there's just such an opportunity there as we think about how implementations are designed and the types of things we ask of our implementing partners to start to get some of this data at more accurate and kind of higher resolutions than has been possible in the past. I'm also very excited about the rapidly decreasing cost of high resolution satellite imagery. To date, we've been really hamstrung by the reliance on data sets like Landsat or Sentinel, which are absolutely wonderful for many purposes, but are challenging to use when you're trying to, say, estimate socioeconomic productivity or other socioeconomic variables. So as those costs goes down, I think we can measure things we've been unable to measure before at scales that we've been unable to do it at before. So I'm very optimistic about what the next decade will bring in measurement precision.
So let me invite the other panelists to see if they want to weigh in, or Paula or Solene.
In terms of measurement or in terms? Okay, well, yeah, I mean, there are many opportunities here. Where I see also a lot of opportunity is, I think this morning we were talking about this. So on collecting information from apps and from, more and more projects, at least at FAO, are integrating these apps that are aimed to monitor the implementation of projects, of the project across the course of the project. And I think that it's super exciting because sometimes, the pace of implementation can also help us to build a counterfactual. At the same time, I see a lot of challenges because also in the ways these devices are used, or, today we also mentioned, potential challenges in measuring, the areas of the project that matter, the plots that matter, or the accuracy of those GIS points can really, be critical, for later on analyzing impact. So I see opportunities, but also challenges in terms of coordination, in terms of quality of the data we're collecting. And so it's not going to be easy either. That would be my
There was a session yesterday where we talked about where to focus effort and where donors sort of be putting some resources. And I wonder, what are those stubborn challenges in either anyone from the audience or the panelists, where you think this would be worth focusing attention? Any thoughts?
Can I maybe expand the question to also include what are some methods that we could use to prioritize areas of focus, or what are some mechanisms that we can put into place to help understand where the need is?
Pose one idea, which is in fact brought up by one of our panelists in the presentation, which is how do we reconcile both socioeconomic and sort of climate environmental goals in these interventions that are quite ambitious. And I wonder if that is an area either of, I would say, priority as we think about the future, but also where we need to make some advances methodologically to be able to tackle.
Probably.
Yeah, Arthur from IFAD. Yeah, I think one of the areas which I think is really critical is actually finding ways to come up with sort of standards and sort of agreed upon, let's say, approaches and methods. Because one of the challenges that I'm seeing, and in our own work as well, is that you have a variety of approaches, right? And I don't think the literature in terms of the methods I don't think we have reached a stage where we have agreement or understanding of what is the best practice. I think we're all doing different things. We're all using different approaches. It's similar to the issue of measurement of resilience. We have our own measure of resilience in IFAD, which looks at a different angle, looking at ability to recover from a shock. We think it's useful. We also know it has its flaws. Like Chris Barrett says, we have flaws. I think we have flaws on measurement. We have flaws on methods, on the methods we use to analyze the data. And when you bring in geospatial data, the other element there is actually the data source itself. I've seen a few presentations during this meeting where you find, for example, somebody's using Landsat 7 to measure NDVI. There's all kinds of different measures, differences. Somebody uses Landsat 8, Landsat 5, or I use EVI, you use NDVI, you use GDMP, all these different things. They're all trying to measure more or less the same thing. And then we all say this is a measure or proxy of yields of crops. And we know there's a disparity between all these indicators and actual crop yields. So I think we need to push the envelope and the methods to push the envelope on measurement and come up with standards with best practice. And that I think is critical to eventually then begin to really leverage this powerful technology. Thank you.
Something. I agree with the standard and best practices, but I am quite agnostic on the approach and the methods. So I will adapt my approach and my methods to my objective, my research question. And we have to preserve this flexibility, because this is true with the integration of geospatial data and impact evaluation. Sometimes now we are at the GeoField, of course, we say it's great, and it's great. It's open a lot of opportunity, but there are the same challenges, the same peril of the traditional impact evaluation with the standard econometric approach. In some cases, using geospatial data is magnify these challenges, this assumption. So we have to be pragmatic, and whenever we need, we cannot be the counterfactual differently, or we cannot collect data because we are in a worse situation, or we can take advantage of using this kind of new technology. But we have to be aware of what are the limitations and what is the objective of our research, our analysis, and what are also the constraints, because nothing is for free. So sometimes using this data is decreasing the cost. Other time instead is an additional cost, and we have to understand if they actually improve, okay, our understanding. That's my point about that. But I agree with you. It's important to create standard. And I think related to the question of Clemencia, looking at the linkages between, we cannot neglect anymore the linkages between the environment and individuals. So socio-economic outcome are related to the environmental outcome. We see it all the time. The definition of food security of FAO is healthy diet for all at all time. When we see healthy diet, there is a straightforward linkages with the environmental consequences of changing diet pattern. So we cannot neglect it anymore in measurement and impact evaluation. This is what over to you.
Yeah, I see that one of the major challenges that we all face here is there are challenges on both ways. Those who are conducting evaluation and those who are specialized in all the other forms of geospatial analysis. There are methodological challenges all the way. And I will take a simple example, those who are conducting RCTs today. And in most of the case, when we come up with the result, we tend to look at the impact that is affecting everybody the same way. That is wrong. There's never any program that affects every individual region or villages the same way. There gotta be heterogeneity in the way people are affected throughout those programs. I was very happy. I wasn't here at the beginning of the presentation. This is another evidence of what you are missing, what you completely ignore the spatial effect and you use a normal approach. There are many other ways where this have been shown, but we still don't, consider those. There are complications in terms of the model. So I think what we need to be doing from now is venue like this where we all convene, being expert on all these benefits and see what can we do to make things, to create that linkages so we can all talk and converge. And finally, making sure that, we are accounting for all these differences. But I said earlier, the challenges are enormous, and we just need to continue until that comes along the way. Yeah, simply just my contribution.
Thank you very much. So first, a special thanks to all the panelists and presenters for really excellent presentations and great insights from your work, and of course for everyone who came. I think it's quite fitting that we end with remarks about the need for something which is really attention. We want standards and we want flexibility. We want, to look at what works for everyone, and we think universally, and yet then we realize that it doesn't quite work that way, and that there are different groups, different populations, different situations, different contexts that affect what we are studying. So the call for more work and the call also for coming together to share and to try to advance the practice is very clear. So I hope there will be more opportunities to do that, and we will get to see all of you. So thank you very much, and a round of applause for the panelists.
A couple of announcements before everyone leaves. So our networking event is starting up where we had lunch on the top floor, outside on the terrace. For those who are relying on the bus, the Gates group that's relying on the bus, you should have an email in your inbox with instructions. The short instructions are that you will meet at 7:45 a.m. in the lobby of the hotel, and Jessica will take you to the bus. But check your email for more information, and I'll see you upstairs.
To those online, thank you for joining us. So
Thank you.